Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches.
Good morning, I'm Jeff Kellam. Welcome to this week's edition of Encounter. As the new year begins, a lot of folks are making New Year's resolutions, of course. On a much deeper level, the kind of Trinitarian formula which leads to reconciliation and new beginnings includes repentance and then forgiveness and then reconciliation. We're going to be talking about that on not a personal scale so much, but on a global scale today. The story has been suppressed for over 60 years. It was the summer of 1950 when U.S. military forces opened fire on a group of South Korean refugees at a railroad trestle near the village of Nogon-ri in Korea. Hundreds were killed, mostly women and children. This was no mistake. It was deliberate. Retreating U.S. commanders had issued orders to shoot approaching civilians to guard against North Korean insurgencies or infiltrations among the columns of refugees. Though one order stated that the troops should fire at anyone trying to cross the lines, it also said to use discretion in the case of women and children. Not much discretion was used. Over these 60 plus years, the story of that massacre was suppressed and denied, unknown, I suppose, by most of us, just plain unknown. But in South Korea, the survivors and the families of those victims cannot forget and cannot let that tragedy be forgotten for future generations. In 1999, a group of Associated Press reporters broke the story, and their book is called The Bridge at Nogon-ri. And it says it's the hidden nightmare from the Korean War. I have two guests who have helped in this process of confessing what took place on behalf of our country, or the citizens at least of our country, and then working toward reconciliation. And we're going to talk about that story today. My guests are Earl Arnold. He is a retired Presbyterian minister who lives in Owego, and his neighbor Ed Kang, also another retired Presbyterian minister, and originally from North Korea. And then Ed and his family, and Ed, you still go back to Korea now and then.
Yes.
And
yes.
Reconciliation is an important part of your visits there. Let's begin with this event. Which of you wants to begin with what took place there?
Well, why don't I start?
Okay.
In 1950, North Korean troops were rapidly coming down the Korean peninsula, pushing back, first of all, the South Korean army, which had been reinforced with some skeleton troops, U.S. troops that had been based in Japan. At the village of Nogon-ri, the American troops set up a defensive line and were preparing for the North Koreans to come. They had been moving a number of civilians out of the little villages along the way, sort of to clear the area so that they would have free fire.
Yeah.
They moved a group of villagers down onto a railroad track, and they were instructed to continue further south on the railroad track. Well, for reasons unknown, they were first inspected by an American reconnaissance plane, and then American fighter planes strafed and bombed the group of refugees. They took refuge under the railroad track.
The refugees
refugees
under the trestle?
The refugees went down. There was a place where this was an elevated rail track. there's a road and a brook that flows under the railroad tracks through these twin tunnels.
Yeah.
And they took refuge under there. Well, there were American troops on the hillsides on both sides ends of the tunnel, and they were given orders by their local commander to fire on these refugees. And for 3 days and 2 nights, the refugees were trapped in that tunnel with machine guns and small arms firing into the tunnel.
Yeah.
And we got to see when we were there the bullets still embedded in the concrete and the bullet holes where they were shot.
So the order was given, and I understand that many of these troops, now they were under the umbrella of the United Nations, right? They're UN
Yes.
troops, but they were US troops.
Yes.
And I understood that some of the soldiers did not want to fire into that crowd, and so that's why there are some bullet marks in the top of the tunnel. They said, well,
They said, we have to follow orders.
yeah.
We have to shoot, but I didn't want to shoot down at where the women and children were. I shot at the ceiling.
Yeah. Now, Ed, you were born in North Korea,
Yes.
and you were not at Nogunri when this occurred, but you were nearby. You were a refugee. Tell me a little bit about what that was like.
Yes. Before I talk about my story at the Nogunri, American troops pushed the refugees to on top of the kind of elevated railroad tracks.
Yeah.
And then they searched everybody and their bags, and they found nothing. And at the same time, then they called the reconnaissance plane to hover around, and then the fighters plane came in straight. That's the kind of thing very important for this incident.
It's
Okay.
important to know that the people were not armed, that they
Yeah.
were innocent, that they were refugees,
That's right.
and yet we still called in the military
Yeah.
to
Yes. And
shoot.
the commanders ordered them to kill, not knowing, who they are. So that's the tragedy happened.
Yeah.
Okay, my story. I was born and raised in Pyongyang, and when the UN troops went up to the north and liberating Pyongyang city, and then they encountered the Chinese troops in the mountains, so they started retreating down. They were moving fast down to the south with the trucks and all the transportation. But the Chinese and the North Korean troops, they were coming down just walking on the foot. And so there's a big gap between the UN troops retreating and the Chinese troops. So we were walking down, no man's land.
Yeah.
And when we crossed, it was difficult to cross because the bridges were all bombed, and we crossed a kind of small pontoon boat tied to empty drums, and we crossed on that thing. And the first night we walked, and then there's no place for us to sleep, so we tried to sleep on the ground with some kind of bonfire warming up. And I was trying to sleep, but I couldn't sleep. So I kind of woke up and saw my mother was sitting up and holding my baby brother all night, And whenever I think about it, I just could not help but to cry, such wonderful mother's love. Yeah.
Yes. So this thing happened, and the as it came to light, the United States government and the military denied, I guess, that it took place.
And then we walked, and when we started walking the next day, same thing happened. We were hundreds, thousands of refugees walking on the railroad coming down to the south. And American jet planes came, and they were diving down to very low, and we didn't know what was happening, but they were strafing and killing all the refugees. So Nogon incident was not really somebody else's story, but that was our story.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, the contrast here, Earl, you didn't know anything about this in your life and ministry as an American. Ed knew about this because he lived it, and that's kind of what leads us now to say this thing came to light in 1999 as the AP reporters kind of revealed it, did the interviews. The book is one of, I think there are other books about it as well. But this is Charles Hanley, Sung Hun Cho, and Martha Mendoza, who wrote the book called The Bridge at Nogon. So when you heard about this, Earl, what was the circumstance of your hearing about it and then acting on your concern?
Well, Ed and I were part of a delegation to Korea in 2014. We were invited there by our partner churches in South Korea as part of a cultural exchange visit. And one of the places that we went was to the Nogon Peace Park. Mm-hmm. They have vivid displays at the Peace Park of what happened. We got to walk in the tunnel itself, through the tunnel itself, hear the story from the son of the man who started the Peace Park. His wife had been there in the tunnel, their infant child, so this would be our host's older brother was killed in the tunnel at Nogon. We were terribly moved. Yeah, this was just an overwhelming experience. So when we came back to the United States, we were part of a Korean partnership group in the Syracuse area, and we said, what can we do in response to this? We can't just let this go by. So we put together an overture to the General Assembly, a request to the National Presbyterian Church to take action, recognizing what happened there and encouraging Presbyterians and others to press the government, the U.S. government, to make an apology, and for the Presbyterian Church on its own behalf to say, yes, this happened, and as Americans, we're so sorry about that. Yeah.
So you acknowledge that it took place, confess that there was complicity on the part of our country at least, and then to look for ways to reconcile conscience and history and the theology of forgiveness and reconciliation. So you took this overture to your presbytery, and did they reject it?
No, they approved it. They adopted and sent it to General Assembly.
So it goes from the presbytery to the National General Assembly.
Yeah.
That's right.
And then it meets in committees and that kind of thing. And how did they respond to this?
The committee rejected it at first. And then they didn't know what to do, and they started voting, and we ignore and discard it. But that was not, that motion was defeated. So what they did was they got the recommendation from the AWACS, the
Advisory Committee on Social Witness.
Yeah, Advisory Committee. The recommendation, there was kind of water down the amended overture, so they adopted that and sent to General Assembly. Yeah.
So rather than going through the polity of the church and the machinations of how this took place, eventually a delegation was sent to South Korea.
Yes.
And what year are we talking about? When did that take place?
That was in November of 2017,
So
last November.
just a couple of months ago.
Yep.
And so the two of you went, along with a delegation which included the stated clerk of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA, which is he would be the highest unelected official, I guess.
Well, he is elected,
He is
but
elected.
He's the one who is permanently there at the Louisville office.
Okay.
And would be the best representative of the Presbyterian Church.
So, and your hosts there were the Presbyterian Church of Korea, and I think, just very briefly, Presbyterians are very, very strong in Korea.
There are more Presbyterians in Korea than in the United States.
Is that right? And I know some of the churches are huge in Korea.
Yes.
And in fact, the Korean church is so strong, they have sent missionaries to the United States, as I understand it.
Yeah.
So that's part of the link between Presbyterians and Korea. It's a historic link. And you mentioned that some of the first missionaries to Korea came out of central New York State.
Yes, when we lived in Ithaca, there was a plaque on the church wall saying Horace Underwood was supported out of the Ithaca church. He came from further north in central New York and was a missionary, one of the first missionaries to Korea in 1885.
So there is